Hello, 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 bird nerds. It's the bird emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I'm a bird nerd. It's my great pleasure to kick off for, what are we, 2022? The wettest year we've had in the 20s so far. And it's Monday Megaphone. And every 2 weeks, it's really exciting. I'll be joined by Holly Parsons and we'll be bringing you the passing parade of bird nerd gurus. And today we've got John Martin and Jennifer Colburn, and we're talking cockatoos, bin chickens, brush turkeys, and all manner of urban birds. Holly is, of course, the leader of the Birds in Backyards Urban Birds Project at BirdLife Australia. Hi, Holly. How are you?
Hi, glad to be back.
It's good, isn't it?
It is. It's great.
And you're just sitting there in trepidation, I would imagine, in the Illawarra, waiting for this tsunami of floodwaters to hit your way, and the rain bomb.
Yes, I heard about the rain bomb. It's a little soggy, but thankfully we're all totally fine, and I think we will.
And joining us down in the Greg Brady Square today is Dr. John Martin. How are you, John? Your main role now is at Taronga Zoo, yes? So John Martin from Taronga Zoo?
That is it. I'm in the office at the zoo today. Spotted some very wet animals, but otherwise everyone's happy and it's nice to be chatting with you.
And I feel like we've got a celebrity because John was so visible for a while there. Every time I turned the TV on, there was John and a cockatoo. So it's a celebrity edition of Monday Megaphone. And in the Alice, I'm sorry you're in Alice, the Housekeeper Square there, Jennifer. Jennifer Colburn, who's in London but is based out of the Vet Med Uni Lab at the University of Vienna, also studying cockatoos. Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Hi, good to see you. Yeah, we actually just got battered by a bunch of storms in the UK too, so I guess everybody's been wet lately.
And Jennifer, you're a perfect example of the intercontinental and international nature of science research, because you're a Canadian whose lab is in Austria, but you're currently in the UK. So actually, I was going to start with John, but let's start with how you got to the UK and Vienna. That's got to be a story.
Yeah, so my project that I'm doing for my PhD is actually designed to be interdisciplinary. So we have our institution at the Veterinary Medicine University of Vienna, and we have Elise's Auersperg's cockatoo lab, and she has a collaboration with the University of Birmingham. So this is about an hour and a half actually out of London. And there's a researcher there called Dr. Sarah Beck, who's done a lot of research into tool innovation in children. So actually my project was conceived as comparing how cockatoos use tools to how children use tools. My investigations with children got cut a little short with COVID, but I did get one study in. So then I was off studying cockatoos. I actually got trapped in Austria for a while. My poor husband was trapped in the UK for 2 years. And now I'm back and I'm actually doing a quick internship to compare capuchins at the zoo in Edinburgh to cockatoos as well. So I'm just running around having fun.
John, that's really got to pique your interest, doesn't it? How are cockatoos like?
Oh, I think the children is a really good one as well, because it's the constant question we get of how smart is a cockatoo, and the investigation of tool use and other behaviours and social interactions that start to help us peel that onion back and start to have a more concrete answer, although it's certainly not rock solid. But Jennifer, you tell me, what did you learn? I can't wait to hear.
So this whole thing got conceived. You might be familiar. There's a very famous task that happened with Betty, the New Caledonian crow, where I think it was in Oxford. Betty was part of this project with these New Caledonian crows where they were seeing if they understood how hooks worked. Mm-hmm. And they had to test in pairs, and her partner flew with the hooked piece of wire. So she bent a hook into her piece of wire in order to solve. So I think they had to dip this hook in to pull a basket out. And of course, this just blew everyone's mind because they made hook tool. And then it turns out the New Caledonian crows do some amazing stuff with tools. And so, of course, we gave that to the cockatoos. And around the same time, Sarah Beck's lab gave the same task to children. And to our surprise, actually, the children are complete rubbish at innovating. Like, they really do badly at it. So the shocking finding was that they weren't innovating the hook tool consistently until about 8 years of age, which if you show them, they'll do it. But even giving them like hints and experience with pipe cleaners, like the kids are just rubbish at it. And so this work's not published yet, but I did some other different tool innovation, and I seem to have found very similar findings that children aren't as great at tool innovators as we thought. And in some ways, our cockatoos outperform them, the younger children, because our cockatoos did do the hook task, several of them. So yeah, they're cool.
John, there's a good place for an introduction into the work that you've been doing with cockatoos. You've been involved with Hollows' Home through the Botanic Gardens and wing tags, and now Big City Birds. So could you maybe walk us through, for anyone who isn't familiar with any of the projects you've been working on, how you got interested in cockatoos and the behaviours that they're exhibiting in the urban environment?
So Holly and I have a mutual friend, Adrian, and he was doing his PhD on parrots competing for tree hollows in the urban landscape. And he was telling me one day about how the cockies were bullies and always kicking other birds out of tree hollows, and all these, he had these observations about cockies, but really no one had done a study on cockies. And I was already thinking about a study on cockatoos, and particularly from an ecological perspective, how many of them are there? What are they eating? Where are they flying? Are they successfully breeding? Are their young successfully fledging and living to be breeding age? So the starting point was really basic. And then that research started with the Wing Tags project so that we could actually mark individuals and be able to monitor their movements and their habitat use and some of their behaviours like breeding and foraging. And then that really got ramped up with the addition of Dr. Lucy Applin, who is a behavioural ecologist. Well, actually, she probably would even go beyond that. And so that was a fantastic example of a collaboration of joining the world of animal behaviour in all of its glory, because it's super duper cool, including the study of humans. We're animals, our behaviours, and linking it to what we were seeing with respect to their ecological adaptations. This is a big bird that's living in the city and is happily going onto people's balconies, 10, 20 stories up on city skyscrapers to be actually go and land on them and be hand-fed and all these things. And you're like, these are not normal behaviours of wild birds. Humans are a ginormous predator compared to an 800 gram to 1 kilogram bird. Yeah, really interesting, and so many questions to explore. And the thing that's really fun there is obviously Jennifer's doing a lot of this stuff in captivity and we're doing it in the wild, and that adds a whole new dynamic, and being able to mark individuals and see where they're going and habituate them and train them to do tasks and learn and see how that information is spreading is very rare in the wild. So it's a very nice study system.
Now I'm just going to put this ticker on, John, for where people can get involved with Big City Birds. So let's talk about what the Big City Birds project is using the app, and what are you wanting people to observe and report?
So Big City Birds is the reincarnation of the Wing Tags project, and that was very targeted to studying marked individuals. And so now it's a broad spectrum across the country. So you can report. We do have focal birds, so cockies, the brush turkeys, the ibis, and corellas. But you can actually report any bird species. And the subtitle of Big City Birds is Adapting to Change. So we're really interested in their behaviours. It's very much driven to now you can report any individual. Are you seeing it nesting? So still ecological information, but that can then lead us to say, oh, wow, they're actually nesting in a new way or at a different time or in a different habitat. And so this can then lead to understanding different behaviours. But things like innovation, which is really Jennifer's area, and looking at, say, the tool use is really what we're talking about there is birds problem solving. And so one of the great examples, lots of people will be familiar, is having a coffee and seeing something like either a rainbow lorikeet or a noisy miner coming and stealing the sugar packets on the table and opening them up and eating the sugar. That's an innovative foraging behavior. They actually had to figure out how to rip those bags open as well. It's quite difficult. It's easy for us. But so, yeah, we're after a whole heap of information across the country. And so why I say it can be for not just our target species is you might see a new behavior and that could start a whole new project for us. It could be something that we suddenly go, wow, that's blowing our minds. Let's go and investigate that further. So I encourage you to share your observations of the birds in your area when you see an interesting behavior. And also the thing that is really challenging is, and Holly can appreciate this especially, is to keep reporting information. So you might see the brush turkeys in your area and they've built a nest mound and you're like, wow, that's really cool. And you report it. Lovely. Well, update us. Are you seeing females going to that mound to lay eggs? Are you seeing chicks hatching? What are they foraging on? So there's just a myriad of information that, to be frank, we don't know. And you can help us understand, and your observations are actually hugely valuable.
Holly, you run, or your BirdLife runs one of the largest bird citizen science projects, which is the great Aussie backyard bird count. I've probably thrown in an extra word or two in there, but I think we all know what it is. How does the information collected in that week-long count overlay with the kind of information that John has collected in his projects? Is there a way that they overlay and that you're all sharing information so that everyone can benefit from one piece of data that's collected by one person?
Yeah, look, there's always ways that we can collaborate and do share data. I know Aussie Backyard Bird Count data has gone to John previously to look at where cockatoos and ibis were being recorded throughout that week-long period. So look, there's always opportunities. And like John said, the more projects that you can submit sightings to and the more detail and how often you can repeat those surveys, the better. The Aussie Backyard Bird Count is great in that it is a week-long event. It gives everybody a very focused activity to count all the birds in their garden for 20 minutes, and you can do that as many times as you like during that week. So that sort of big census event really gives us a broad overview of what's going on amongst the bird community and where the sort of major trends are, who's holding out on top, who might be becoming a little less common. So it gives us those sort of broad overarching changes. And then you can delve into a whole variety of different projects depending on where your interest is. John's amazing work with big city birds is really, like he said, looking at those behaviours. So what's happening in urban spaces that is a little bit different to what might be happening in a natural environment? Where are we seeing these unusual behaviours? Elsewhere in BirdLife, the Birds in Backyard surveys that are part of my Urban Bird program look at how our garden characteristics relate to what our bird communities are like, so we can pull out tailored information on how to create spaces for different types of birds. There's a myriad of opportunities out there to explore, and you don't have to just stick to one project and be loyal to one project. You can switch around between a whole heap. The nature of citizen science is that it's supposed to be collaborative, and so that's collaborative amongst from the researcher and the participant or the citizen scientist, but it's very much researcher to researcher as well. There's a lot of opportunities for our data to be made available and explored in a whole range of different ways.
John and Jennifer, I want to pose a question. I'm not sure how the best way to phrase it is, so forgive me if I mangle this and take a long time to get there, but I'm wondering if, Jennifer, you're seeing in the lab similar kinds of behaviours that must be either learned or that the birds think them up themselves to what you have been seeing, John, amongst wild populations. So the point really is, are they deciding and working things out for themselves individually, or do we think that there's some innate knowledge amongst cockatoos that helps them exploit the urban environment or man-made objects? There we go. How did I go?
I know I can speak in our lab that we do know that our cockatoos can socially learn from each other. I actually haven't talked about even what kind of cockatoo we study. It's actually a Corella. It's a Goffin's cockatoo, but also known as the Tannenbar Corella. So these aren't the ones that you're going to find in Australia. They're in this very small area, the Tannenbar Islands in Indonesia. And so they're endemic there, though there are several invasive populations. And so when we discovered the tool use in Austria, at that point, very little was known about the wild, but we have this wonderful postdoc, Mark O'Hara, who established his own lab out in Tannenbar. So we are actually collecting data on the wild cockatoos. And he recently found, just a few months ago, the big press blitz came out. They found that the cockatoos were using tools in the wild, but completely different to how the ones in the lab did, which isn't surprising. So our individuals in the lab use tools differently. They learn from each other. We've had the original cockatoo who learned it first. The other cockatoos who learned it later did it completely differently. And then the ones in the wild became famous for using what's called a tool set. So this is the first bird ever recorded to use a tool set. So the media calls it, where they basically were wedging into these sea mangoes where you can't eat the outside, and using different sizes of tools. And Mark did this wonderful job of mocking up the different tools and their different functions. So yeah, you do see a lot of variety. It doesn't seem to be something that's innate. They seem to just really like to combine objects, because we're seeing huge individual differences. We're seeing big population differences. And I think that's similar to the cleverness that you're seeing out in Australia in the urban wild. And in fact, speaking of citizen science, we actually had, it was a group of birders out in Singapore where there's a big invasive population, and they saw the Goffins there and videoed them doing object combinations that looked like tool use. At the time, my supervisor was very conservative about saying that, but now it's looking like that probably was another population that's independently figuring out things to do with objects. I find that very interesting.
Yeah, and from the observation here in Sydney with the sulphur-crested cockatoos, the paper we published last year was highlighting that not all individuals were capable of opening the household bin lids to scavenge food. We noticed it was predominantly adult males, and that it certainly is a learnt behaviour that is socially learnt within discrete groups, and that in neighbouring groups there was the same behaviour going on, but you could see that they had their own way of opening it. So we call this the cultural diversity of that social learning. And so a simple analogy I use for that is, in Sydney, people will have a schooner. In Melbourne, people will have a pint. And so that's a cultural difference. But we could see that at a much smaller scale, and we're talking even only 5 or 10 kilometres, that flock of birds, you're talking maybe 100 cockatoos, that's those individuals who had learnt this behaviour and could perform this behaviour. There was similarities at the small scale of 100 birds at that site. You go 5, 10 Ks away, those other 100 birds actually did the same behaviour, but in a slightly different way. And so to the question and Jennifer's comments there, it's not innate. I think the innate thing is that they're intelligent and inquisitive and capable of learning. And then it comes back to opportunity and different exposures. And so there's a lot more to learn, because by saying it's adult males, there's a physical component to that as well. They are slightly larger, but they're not. It's not even really 10%. So there's a lot more to refine, and it's really, I think, Grant and Holly, the key thing when we're talking about this space of research is it's actually a relatively new field when you think about the diversity of species. So it's been going for, let's say, 80 years, but in the wild and in captivity, in more detailed about social learning and tool use. But the diversity of species is actually tiny. So, we've got a lot to learn.
What do these kind of findings, and I know that the work is ongoing and not all published yet, but what can we as gardeners, urban space managers, take from what Jennifer and John and other researchers are learning about bird behaviour and apply it in some sense to our own really minor micro conservation efforts in the urban environment? Have we got to the point where we can apply some of the things that that John and Jennifer and their colleagues are learning to actually give us more bang for our conservation buck?
Yeah. Oh, good question. So I guess in terms of whether there needs to be an action, I guess it would depend on whether there's a problem to begin with. If all the cockatoos all of a sudden learn how to open bins and are causing chaos and ripping out rubbish every bin day, then maybe that means that we need to think about how we better contain our rubbish. And certainly we see that on school grounds as well, with all open lid bins, and cockatoos and ravens have a field day after lunchtime finishes on a lot of school grounds. It may be that we need to think of solutions when a problem emerges because of this behaviour. But I think it's also, just from a really basic level, I think it's really great to dispel the bird brain myth that birds they are not stupid creatures. They are incredibly intelligent, and this sort of tool learning and using absolutely demonstrates that. And so I think there's a great strength in people recognising and understanding the intelligence of these birds, and it helps people feel connected to them and want to take action for them when you can see just how smart they are. So I think that's another really great strength of some of this work for sure.
John, the question has to be asked, is there a problem? I'll preface it again with something that I see as an issue in the way we think about wild animals. If ibis and cockatoos and countless other birds are exploiting our refuse as a food source, doesn't that tell us that maybe we should be giving them an opportunity to find food in a way that doesn't piss us off? There we go. Comment.
There are so many things to comment on there. So, look, I love the prior question about what we can do in habitat. And of course, Holly's done a lot in this space and continues to do that through BirdLife Australia. It's a really interesting one with respect to the resources that are available and those individual species adaptability and how they're exploiting different resources. From what can we do, a human solution, because that's actually, we're the ones who are in the position to really solve this problem. I was reading a book the other day, and food waste, us not eating all of our food and throwing away scraps, is a significant issue globally and is a significant issue from a climate change perspective. It's also from a world hunger perspective. Let's all be more sustainable with the food that we actually buy and make sure that we use it and have a compost so that we're not putting it in the garbage bin. Or maybe we need parents to be far stricter with their children so they eat their lunches. No, I don't know, I'm talking. But so, yeah, there are the idea of us modifying our behaviours is really the starting point. And one of those is providing habitat that incorporates food plants. And for those of you who love an ibis, we were just talking about a bit of wet weather during the start of this chat. I love watching them out there in the sports field. So all of these footy fields that are all over the landscape, they're probing into the soil and eating the worms that are in that flooded soil. And I always just think of them as little gardeners out there. Yeah, it's about what you appreciate. So this is part of that other aspect that is really interesting about Jennifer's research, and not the focus, but the idea of integrating, asking questions about humans and our behaviours and our learning abilities, is that thing of how do we get people to appreciate these aspects of wildlife and their behaviours and live with them rather than be upset by them.
That actually dovetails really well into my master's work, which was actually looking at raccoons in the city of Toronto in Canada. So my interest is actually also urban wildlife, which I'm hoping to do more with the cockatoos in the near future. And my supervisor out there, Suzanne McDonald, helped the city redesign the rubbish bins because the raccoons were out of control. Some of the cockatoos can do it, but all the raccoons used to be able to open the bins quite easily, actually. They do have thumbs. They're not opposable, but they have thumbs. They're very persistent, and they were causing havoc. And actually, what's interesting is that, so Toronto's overrun with raccoons. The nickname Raccoon City is very apt. And at one point, I think my supervisor estimated something like 100 raccoons per square kilometer. Oh, it was like really ridiculous, the high density. And part of it was eating the rubbish, because raccoons do this thing with the more body fat they are, the bigger their litters are. And so that was like exponentiating. So I don't know now what's happened now that these new bins have been introduced. A few of them did actually manage to figure out how to break them. But generally, keeping the rubbish down and letting them eat more natural food. I think, at least in the case of the raccoons, which if you've ever seen raccoons on YouTube getting stuck in things in North America, it's because they're so busy from eating all of our junk food. And then they're having these mega litters that can't sustain. And then rabies and canine distemper just like runs through these populations. And it's actually quite devastating. And I should imagine from my experience with cockatoos, at least, that they're more likely to breed the better fed they are. Although I think the hollows, which John knows all about, is a factor playing into that.
And yeah, I guess that dovetails nicely into the behaviour of people feeding wildlife, which I know Holly's done a lot of work on as well. And we know lots of people feed cockatoos. The simple comment that I always say to people is they don't need your food. There is so much food in the landscape. Barbara Klomp, who works with us on the Big City Birds project, she was surveying foraging behaviours and within 1 month had identified over 100 different plant species that they were foraging on just in a very small area of Sydney. That's subsampling observations. You can't follow multiple flocks of cockatoos every second of every day. So there's a huge amount of food that they've got available to them. And yeah, it does fluctuate. But if you've ever seen cockies just sitting on the grass, they're eating the herbs like bindies and they're eating just the grass shoots. If you can see greenery, there's cockatoo food. And of course, they'll eat flowers and seeds. Yeah. And the other aspect to that, I'll just always add to people is, so first, they don't need your food. The second thing is, you're not the only one feeding them. So try to have some moderation because we've learnt this with particularly the tag. They will fly from balcony to just be fed. And it's fascinating and really amazing that they can literally learn the timing of human behaviours. So they know that people are turning up at their places from work at certain times and we'll feed them at certain times. And so you'll see them just sitting there waiting. It's beautiful to have these interactions. So hopefully people are appreciating that unique experience as well.
John, there's a good point for me to update Holly. Remember, Holly, we had this discussion to feed or not to feed, and that I was wrestling with my decision about feeding my local gang of corellas and crested pigeons, of course, as they were hanging out. John, they knew the time that I would be likely to be heading across the road to distribute some seed in the park. And they were insistent. They'd come and sit on my fence and wake me up if I was late. I no longer feed, Holly. I took that on board, especially after talking with David and with Johanna about all the kinds of risks that it poses. So I no longer feed. I'm happy about that. But at the same token, there are now only a handful instead of the 35-odd long-billed corellas that come. There are now no little corellas that come, and they're the consistent 3 or 4 sulphur-crested cockatoos that come. I'm sad that I don't see any galahs anymore, but those galahs are only coming because they were easy. They were just coming because I was being slack.
So to jump on that, they're there. They are in the area. They just aren't in your backyard. That's why I really love eBird as well as Bird Data or these other citizen science. So you can now go for a walk, go for your 2-3K walk and do a bird list every day. So there are lots of ways that you can still enjoy them. One of the things that I love about that is when you do see something you don't see regularly, and you also see those seasonal visitors. There are lots of ways to enjoy and have those interactions. And to me, the behaviours, so what you're talking about, Grant, as well, is you would actually be seeing a lot of social interactions, and that's really key for some of our research, is looking at how we assess that it was the adult males and particularly some of the more dominant individuals is by actually assessing their social hierarchies. So looking at who's the top dog, so to speak. And so everyone who's out there feeding wild, you're actually opening a little window into the society of those species and multiple different species and how they're interacting. But I think it washes over a lot of us unless you actually really feel like who some of them are and start observing in more detail.
That's actually the thing I feel bad about with not feeding the birds, is that I'm no longer learning personally anything about that group of, it's not only the cockatoos and the corellas, the long-billed corellas, and the relationships within those groups, but also between the different species, because the sulphur-cresteds, when they want to be, they're the king of the heap. But for most of the time, they let the long do whatever they wanted. And then obviously when the cocky decided, nah, I'm hungry, he'd go in and knock everyone else away.
Clearly you don't have rainbow lorikeets because they are the king of those birds you've mentioned.
I was going to make a cocky comment before, John. Imagine if rainbow lorikeets were the size of sulphur-crested cockatoos. There would be no other birds in the landscape. That would they the bully boys. Now we do have lots and lots of rainbow lorikeets, but nobody around here is feeding them. And the one thing that I really often tempts me back into feeding this group of birds is that all of my neighbours are highly urbanised, and we're in the west, so we don't have a lot of people who, I don't know, perhaps socialised to be. I don't know how to use the term, but there's fruit trees here. There's not native gardens. People are not planting gardens for wildlife, and so it's quite different to what you would experience in a lot of streets in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. People are not generally enjoying birds. So it was great watching my neighbours when they were going to the kids' playground or doing the laps of the park to actually notice these birds and get involved, and the kids were getting excited by the birds. I wonder whether I might have been doing a community service, but I erred on the health and safety of the birds, and they're no longer getting fed.
I've got a solution for you, Grant, if you want.
Yeah, what's that, mate?
You enroll to do a research project, maybe a master's. You get your ethics approval for humans and for wildlife, and now you do a social ecological research project. You can assess if your feeding of the birds is actually making those people happy. You can assess the behaviour of the birds. There's so much you can do, and a lot of it is new information. So it's that easy. You're allowed to do it then.
I think the only problem with that is that I'd have to do a degree before I did my master's. I'm not sure anyone's going to let me directly into a master's. I'm only 1 year short. I just
You're
don't
only
think
1 year away then.
I just don't think there's that pathway. I would like to do it though. I would love to do it.
I think you've got a couple of co-supervisors here that would be like, yep, this would be very interesting research.
But the other solution is the project is done by someone in your area and you are their key volunteer. You're out there with authority.
All right, hook me up. Let's anybody watching in the future, I'm really up for that. Anyone in the western suburbs of Melbourne who can enrol in a master's now and set one up, hook me up. Look at these supervisors we've got. This would be amazing. John, I wanted to ask you something about the adult males being the birds that pass on or mainly exhibit the behaviour and then seem to be passing it on. Is that because cockatoo society is, let's anthropomorphise it, you know what I mean? Is that because cockatoos are a sexist bunch? Are lady cockatoos probably capable of fulfilling that role, but the way they are organised doesn't allow them to do it?
They're not. So the flock, and this is some research led by a PhD student of ours, Julia Pendorf, who's just an amazing operator in the field. She knows the birds and they know her as well. It's really quite an interesting thing to see her at work. So she's assessed the social hierarchies of different flocks. And what we see is that the dominant breeding pair in sulphur-crested cockatoos, the male and female, they are ranked number 1 and 2. And that adult female, she can push around even the number 2 male if she chooses. And yeah, it's an interesting question there. I think that does then lead towards the fact that there might be a physical component to who's opening the bin lids with respect to them just being slightly larger and slightly heavier, so they're stronger. But there's a lot more to learn here as well in this space. And so then let's just forget about bins because that adds that physicality. There, of course, there's the work that Jennifer's doing and others where it's actually not, it's about brains because they've all got their beak and their foot. And so can they actually figure out how to do it? And we've still got more work to do there on the cockies. We've started doing some research in that space, but it's quite challenging doing it in the wild because you do get someone just walks by and all the birds fly away or a dog runs through. You also have to, before you can work with them, is you have to habituate them, mark them, train them. And so there's all these steps, whereas I'll throw this one to Jennifer and say, with your captive research where you've got these birds, are you seeing any sexism, or is this, it doesn't exist? What's happening?
Sample size isn't quite big enough that we've wanted to say anything conclusive on that, but typically our males outperform our females, with the exception of our highest ranking female. And one suggestion, and at this point it is complete speculation, is that because the males have to provide for the females when they're nesting, that puts a lot of pressure on the male to be a good provider and to forage more. It could even just be more of a motivation than an intelligence. It's very hard to disentangle those two things. And it's the same, like the size difference is almost negligible, but the fact that it's persisted could have some meaning there. I'm not entirely sure. It could be just from dominance battles or something like that. But I do seem to recall this study happened quite a while ago, probably about 20 years, but the Kia in New Zealand, they found the same thing, that the males were the ones opening the bin. And I think actually they're the ones who made that suggestion that it had something to do with having more pressure on the males to provide. But in that case, body size probably really did help.
Yep. With the Kias, it was a pretty small sample size as well. So, yeah, Grant, this is just one of those challenges. So with Julia's work looking at the social hierarchies, she's focused on 3 flocks, and those flocks can have up to 100 members and sometimes more. There you're talking about a large sample size for assessing those 3 flocks. But of course, there are thousands of flocks of sulphur-crested cockatoos across the country. And the implication from those that we've studied is that there is this consistency with the social hierarchy. But because we've looked at a couple of other flocks a little bit further afield, but still, we're talking about 6 or 7 flocks. It's not 100 flocks anyway. And that's always one of the challenges, as Jennifer said. Jennifer's research, maybe you've got 10 or 20 birds in captivity. It's often even less than that. Yeah, it's hard to be sure. One of the things that's really interesting and has been added a lot of uncertainty with some of our work is the juveniles. And with the sulphur-crested cockatoos, they're not adults until they're 7 years old. And we're seeing that there are very different behaviours between adults and juveniles, and movements. And so there's we've got years and years of fun to have researching these individuals. And then just back to the bins, just because it's relevant, you can appreciate that you actually might only need one individual to be able to perform this behaviour in a flock, because as soon as they open the lid, all the birds can access the food. So it isn't something that everyone needs to learn. And there is this secondary behaviour of just scrounging that food resource that an additional individual has that skill. And that's something that has been seen in lots of different species, and not so much so shown to be a socially learnt behaviour. That's not where it's come from, but it's just literally parasitizing knowledge. I can see that this other human has found the best sale. I'm going to go there and get cheap mangoes, whatever it is. It's something that we do in our daily lives as well.
John, I'm still wondering, because we're saying that it's a behaviour that is passed on in general, and looking at the map.
Sorry, passed on is an interesting phrasing. Learnt?
Yeah. What? Yeah. So it's not hereditary knowledge, of course. But what I was just looking at having a look at the map again of the big city birds data, and you've got 10,000 of the observations in Sydney, and then much smaller numbers across the country. But I'm wondering, are there smart flocks because there is a cockatoo in that flock that has learned a particular behaviour, whether it's opening bins or to use an implement or something like that, and that says, are there dumb flocks? Are there less intelligent flocks? Like, does one flock need to observe and learn the behaviour, or are these behaviours popping up independently in other locations around the country?
Grant, thank you for asking that question. The check is in the mail.
That's my pleasure. What am I here for? I'm not here because I'm a genius.
Because this is the whole point about innovate is actually something that can be happening spontaneously. And so this same behaviour of bin opening that we've been talking about, we've been observing that in southern Sydney And there's reports of it occurring in southern Victoria, around near Lorne and Torquay. And so that is mind-blowing to us, because what it suggests is that the birds have innovated essentially the same behaviour independently. The reason why it's independent is because our monitoring of cockatoo movements has shown that they are extremely unlikely to have flown 2,000 kilometres to this other population, and a bird has then socially taught them how to do it. So that means that independently, 2,000 kilometres apart, birds have come up with this solution to a problem. Why they've needed to come up with that solution? Maybe they didn't need to, but they did because they're inquisitive. It's a very interesting point that you're making. And no, I'd say every flock has intelligence, and it's really about opportunity. And so this is where your observations around the country are really valuable to us. And the reason why we've got lots of reports in Sydney and not a lot around the rest of the country is because we've started this work in Sydney. And so we've really engaged the community here and had quite a bit of media interest here. But it's very hard to have the media in Brisbane run the story about cockatoos in Sydney and ask you to report them. So, yeah, that's one of the challenges we have. And that's why it's great to be chatting with you, and hopefully you'll be participating and others will as well around the country.
I have to say, John, I'm the worst person to do recording on the go. I've never been a bird lister, and I think it's hard to develop a habit at my age that you've never had previously. I watch birds all the time. Do I ever write down what I see? Almost never. I talk about it. I'll talk about it until the cows come home. But doing something that seems like work, oh my God.
Seems like work. Interesting. I think of it as fun. Like, I was walking into work this morning and I was like, oh, there's a baby brush turkey, report it. And then I saw another one eating some figs, I can report it. And I certainly get in the habit. It takes me a second. But yeah, I know.
I really need to do it, because I always want to record, especially the honey eaters around here. I mean, this has been one of the things that I've been noticing, is that there's less species and there's less of the species that I see, which is part of the whole bird emergency thing. But John, I wanted to ask you particularly, as Jennifer has said, her study species is an Indonesian species. Cockatoos, highly intelligent large parrots are found through parts of Southeast Asia. Are there other reports, apart from what we've been told about in Singapore, from a sort of feral escapee or introduced population of cockatoos? Are wild cockatoos displaying similar behaviours of let's say smart behaviour? Cockatoos are super smart. Anyone who comes up against them in their daily life will know that. But are Timor, are Port Moresby, other urban centres in Indonesia reporting any of these kind of behaviours?
Not that have been reported in a research capacity, and that's one of the challenges of understanding what's going on in the landscape. There might be videos on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube, and this is actually how the New Caledonian crows were first identified. Was that Christian over in Scotland observed on Flickr someone's photos of these birds using sticks, and he went and did some research on them. So, your observations are valuable, and the challenge that you're highlighting there, Grant, is how do research tap in to your observations? And this is how citizen science has become such a popular space, is that it is a way that we've got an app, people can report it, it puts my contact details out there, people could just email me or message me, and that happens all the time. People have unique observations. But no, it hasn't happened yet, Grant, that we've received reports from some of those other spaces where sulphur-crested cockatoos occur. And there's perhaps a key thing to comment on that, which is cockatoos being socialised in a way in Port Moresby, for example, where they're scavenging in people's backyards and perhaps even being fed by people. So they're actually being given the opportunity where they might be interacting with something like a household bin and have the opportunity to innovate. Potentially not. because potentially there isn't the same wildlife-friendly dynamic in some different spaces. And I've certainly seen that. I haven't been to Port Moresby, unfortunately, but I'd look forward to getting there one day. Lots of cities, let's use much bigger cities as examples than Port Moresby, aren't very wildlife-friendly and aren't very diverse with the wildlife that they have. Even in highly tropical areas, you often see cities are very much concrete and dominated by a very small number of species. So we're pretty lucky, and I'm sure Jennifer is looking forward to visiting at some point and sitting in the park with with 6 or 7 different cockatoo species all trying to sit on her and interact with her.
Yeah, the big behavioral ecology conference that was supposed to be in Australia. I was supposed to go to that. Yeah. But on that topic, actually, from what I know of the Goffin's cockatoos that are in Singapore's a great city for having lots of plant diversity, but they've planted a lot of ornamentals that aren't necessarily native. And the Goffin's cockatoos have figured out how to exploit these because they're very good at exploiting novel food sources, including rubbish bins, and they're pushing out the native parrot species. And from what and again, there's actually no data on this, but we know that there's populations in Hong Kong, I think Taiwan. I've been trying to track them because they should be in some of the Indonesian islands where they're not supposed to be from the bird market trade. And I've actually been using photo apps because every blue moon I'll find something tagged where it should not be and try to figure out if it's breeding. So we still don't even know entirely where all these invasive cockatoo populations are. To my surprise, there's a stable population in Hawaii, but they don't seem to have expanded. They're just running around. But yeah, in the case of Singapore, that they've become an invasive species and they probably don't belong there, as nice as it might be to have.
No. That really highlights another issue which is always dear to my heart, the horticultural plantings, the decisions that people take when it comes to ornamental plantings in a private garden, but then also the streetscapes and the public parks and all those horticultural decisions that are made generally for completely other reasons always have an impact on what birds can exploit. So Melbourne has a very varied horticultural palette, so to speak. So there's a lot for wild birds to eat before they need to head to the bins, I think. A lot of other places have a far more uniform horticultural palette. So that's just another dimension of complexity. Now, we're getting to that time where we need to start thinking about wrapping up. But, John, brush turkeys and bin chickens, I think we love them for different reasons. What are some of the really interesting things you've discovered? Actually, let's tell our worldwide audience what a bin chicken is and what a brush turkey is.
Yeah, so the Australian white ibis is the bin chicken, and people might be most familiar with the African sacred ibis, which is one of the Egyptian gods, or the head at least, of Thoth. And so this is a large white bird here in Australia, occurs in Papua and parts of Indonesia as well. And it has unfortunately lost a lot of its habitat, which goes back to one of our earlier points, Grant, out in the western wetlands through agricultural practices and human damming and water extraction. And so it's quite a phenomenal example of a species that has completely different behaviours in its natural habitat compared to in the urban environment. And we don't have good understanding of the movements between those two spaces. We've only done limited tracking, and there isn't a lot of movement to the city from the country, but there is some movement to the coast and to some of the coastal towns. But yeah, birds out west, when you go to one of the western wetlands, which are all flooded at the moment, you're not going to get very close to the ibis. They're going to fly away from you very quickly. Whereas here in the city, you sit down in the park and an ibis spies that you've got some food. You've got a friend for life, or at least until the food runs out. They're an interesting species that people dislike, I think mostly because they didn't think that they were a native species for starters. They thought that they were an introduced African sacred. And then secondly, they do sometimes share your lunch uninvited, and so that's not the most endearing attribute of a relatively large bird. They're 60 centimetres tall, and they've got a beak that's 20 centimetres long, and they reach in and sometimes steal your lunch. So they can be intimidating, and Sometimes they do stink with nesting and other things in undesirable locations. But their adaptability is really amazing. The food, they'll know. I'd like to tell people the reality is they're a predator. They're out there actually hunting other animals to eat them. They eat snakes and frogs and fish, and they're obviously worms and these things. But now they're just getting all these free lunches with rice and noodles and sandwiches. You know, that behavioural plasticity of being able to eat those different foods and live in those different habitats, nesting in palm trees, just bonkers for a wetland bird.
One of the assets, the great values of the ibis in an urban setting is that because they eat the witchetty grub, for want of a better term, but that little curl bug that eats the roots of sports fields. If you've got
the economy thousands of dollars, Grant.
But not only that, if you do not need to spray chlorpyrifos on your sports field, you are actually protecting the diversity in all your waterways that wash off from the sports field. Chlorpyrifos is a terrible thing to be putting out in the environment. And it is cumulative. It's very difficult for most animals to break down, if not impossible. So we should celebrate the ibis that are helping control the dead patches on your sports field. So please them.
I look forward to this, Grant. I look forward to this campaign to rebrand them so people are all over this, because I agree with you. They deserve it. They absolutely should be praised as the beautiful animals that they are. And I'll just jump to the turkeys, because I know time is of the essence and I don't want everyone to disappear. But the Australian brush turkey is a similarly large bird, and it's mostly flight. It lacks the whiteness. It's got a little bit of mottled white and black on its belly, but it's a mostly black bird. And a fantastic first name for it from European colonists was the New Holland vulture, because they have a bold red head. The skin is red. Here in the Sydney region where I am, they're called the gwila by the local Aboriginal people, if I haven't completely butchered the pronunciation. And they're a megapode, which means they've got pretty large feet, and they're in this group of birds that have a very unique nesting behaviour of raking up all the leaf litter for this species. That's what they do, and they use that decomposing leaf litter, the heat of that, to incubate their eggs. That produces the temperature. So they don't sit on their eggs like most birds. In Australia, there are 3 species that have this similar behaviour. One's the malleefowl. They rake up the soil, and the soil sits in the sun, and the heat incubates the eggs. The orange-footed scrubfowl up north, it also uses the decomposing leaf litter. And so, yeah, these birds have been wiped out of some of the urban areas over the last century or so, and for a number of reasons, through a number of behaviours, I should say, not for a number of reasons. And one of those is these nest mounds are highly susceptible to destruction and easily found and destroyed by people. There are also, eggs in them were a preferred food source by Aboriginal people, but also by anyone else who could get their hands on them. And of course, that includes animals like foxes and dingoes and dogs and goannas. There are a range of different threats to this species, and that gets exacerbated by the fact that they provide zero parental care. The chicks hatch, dig their way out of the nest mound, and on their own. And when you see these little fluff balls the size of your fist running around, you do think, geez, there's some more d'oeuvres in the garden. I'll just go and eat that, especially if you're a cat. So that's a major threat to them, is people with cats. So you need to keep your cat inside. Yes, Jennifer, I see that you've got a lovely cat. You're in London. It doesn't matter.
Cat just has an amazing sense of timing, because she literally showed up when you said the word cat. The British are awful about not keeping their cats indoors. It's shocking.
So are the Australians.
Oh, really? But...
Yeah. Well, John, are the brush turkey increasing or decreasing in numbers in the urban?
Definitely increasing in the urban sphere. We've been calling it the turkey tsunami. It's crashing over Sydney at the moment. Over the last couple of decades, the numbers have been increasing, and they're moving into new areas that people haven't seen them in for well over half a century, if not longer. And so that's phenomenal. This is an excellent example of a species that's recovering through natural processes. And part of that is we've improved the greening of the landscape. So those urban green backyards and street tree plantings, urban parks, are helping. But this species has been protected since the 70s in New South Wales when National Parks and Wildlife Act came in. And I suspect that's actually had quite an important role for them as well, in that you couldn't just go out and shoot this bird if you wanted to. It was now protected. And yeah, it's very interesting, the return of the turkey. And so what we're seeing in Sydney currently has actually already occurred in the Gold Coast and parts of Brisbane, and they're still spreading across Brisbane, but they've certainly conquered Brisbane, and they're in the process of conquering Sydney at the moment. And yeah, so a really phenomenal story, and their adaptability is really important there as well. They can eat anything, and they're very tolerant of disturbance. But yeah, their nest mounds are probably their weakness, and their chicks being unprotected. So,
Holly, did the bird count data reinforce that wider than Sydney, Brisbane, and maybe the Gold Coast and Sunny Coast? In the wilder regions, was the brush turkey holding its own?
Oh, you put me on the spot, Grant. No, there's certainly, in terms of urban spaces, which is where most people who are doing the Aussie backyard bird count are doing it, that Sydney, Gold Coast, Brisbane and southeast Queensland, that's the kind of the core brush turkey urban distribution, really, and a bit further up, of course, across the Queensland coastline as well. And the species that John talking about, your sulphur-crested cockatoos and your brush turkeys and ibis, and they've got this sort of common thread that makes them an urban success story, and that's things like being able to be really flexible with their diets and being able to nest in novel locations that are a little bit unusual, ibis getting into palm trees and things, and being able to exploit a lot of different environments is certainly what can make an urban bird do really in urban landscapes. Where we find birds are less common or in decline is where they have very specific types of requirements that they need. In areas they may be very shrub dependent, and of course shrubs are the things that are often lost out of the vegetation that's lost out of our landscape. They may have a very particular diet. They only eat a select number, or they're only insectivorous, for example. Those are the birds that really start to struggle. And so if we're looking at maintaining a balance, it's around how do we provide those specific resources that are going to help the birds with the specific requirements. And your ibis and your sulphur-crested cockatoos, for the most part, are doing pretty well. Of course, there's always going to be an issue around things like hollows, but for the most part, it's great to have some good success stories.
Well, there'll be plenty more about hollows coming up in the next little while on the Bird Emergency, so watch that space if you're interested in hollows. There's a whole lot of new stuff happening in development there. Now, let's wrap up. Jennifer, we'll start with you. Can you share with us where people can track the work you and your collaborators are doing? And also, can you share perhaps your most surprising observation when it comes to one of your cockatoos? What's the thing that you've seen that has surprised you the most?
That's a tall order. I mean, to the first thing there, probably for anyone who's dying to see the tool use, you just type in Goffin's cockatoo. You're going to see the wild ones, and you'll see the famous first one, Figaro. Figaro's a movie star. He's an ego. He's in charge of the lab. He's a bit of a tyrant, but he invented tool use, so he's the big guy. So yeah, Figaro's all over the internet. And you can follow me on Twitter and Mark O'Hara as well. Our Tannenbar lab is on there. My supervisor, Elise, keeps thinking about making a website or Twitter, but it's not too hard to find us because nobody else is studying Goffin's cockatoos. That's basically us. The things about the cockatoos. So in some ways, my project got quite changed, and I had the opportunity to hand raise the last babies that we had that have entered our aviary. So I actually lived in the aviary. It's quite a cross between field work, and we had some amenities, but it was fun. So that's what I did during COVID. I raised cockatoos. And it's amazing how much they do learn from their parent, which was me. And of course, I was integrating them with the cockatoos. We didn't want them to be overly dependent. You want them to be hand-reared so that they'll work with humans, but you also don't want them to just be a pet. And yeah, it's amazing. From a very young age, they begin manipulating objects, and they're very playful animals. And having raised other animals, kittens and puppies, which are also very playful, they're playful in a very directed way. It's really interesting to watch the way that they work with objects, in a lot of ways reminding me of my own nieces and nephews. And the connection you have with them is different than you have with other mammals. And I think part of it is just because they enjoy music, they enjoy rhythm, you could talk to them, they understand your emotions. Our cockatoos understand quite a few things, actually probably more than we think. They speak German and English, and one of ours speaks Spanish as well. Yeah, it's fascinating, just the connection you can have with these animals. That said, my token, do not get a cockatoo as a pet. Absolutely not. Zero, no. Just because we have them in captivity. We have a massive outdoor aviary, and even so, the amount of trouble these cockatoos can get into, the homeowners just tear their hairs out there. I think it's 90% of cockatoos are given up in the first 3 years. They're awful pets.
And if you're my age and you get a young cockatoo as a pet, then you're going to have a very distressed middle-aged bird when you die. Yeah. So just don't.
Some of the umbrellas have made it to 90 years old. Yeah. And even these ones, my supervisor had to make provisions in a will because some of them might outlive her. And she's a young supervisor, but it's not impossible. Yeah.
So the Tannenbar Corella, near threatened in the wild. So there's probably some work that's got to be done to look after them. But it's the smallest of the white cockatoos smaller, even smaller than the Philippine cockatoos.
And I don't know how people handle the big ones because these little ones are loud enough and they cause enough destruction. But yes, as for conservation, actually, who has our Tannenbar lab is working right now with local people. He's very focused on involving local people, creating awareness, because to them, they're just these white, ugly, loud birds that destroy the crops.
Jennifer, I'll ask you because I'll forget later. I'd love you to put me in touch with Mark so I could talk about that. I'm really into the local forest rangers and things like that, as we found out about when we did the Philippines cockatoo. That's the central tenant in protecting them. John, your turn. Let's put the ticker up again for spotteron.com/bigcitybirds/info. That's where you can get the app. But where could people keep an eye on what you're doing? And what's the most surprising thing? Perhaps you could give us 3 examples all the bin chickens, the cockies, and the brush turkey.
There's a lot.
I know you've got to earn your substantial paycheck of $0 on this show.
Yeah. Look, this one isn't a learnt thing necessarily, but I think people don't necessarily appreciate how cute these animals are because all 3 of the ones that we've touched on are often seen as a bit of a nuisance. And if anyone's seen a picture of a baby ibis, they are absolutely adorable. and I think, that's just one of those things that there's an opportunity there for all of us to appreciate different aspects of these animals, and whether it's their intelligence or their persistence or just the fact that they have very unique lifestyles and don't really fit the bill but are surviving and adapting, such as no parental care. But look, so I'm on social medias with Big City Birds has its own handle, but also for myself at Wing Tags. And so that's on all the different platforms. People can always just find me on the Taronga Zoo website as well. So there's my contact details are there. With respect to some of the things, I've been blown away by how little sulphur-crested cockatoos move. So the longest movement we've had of a cockatoo is 60 Ks. And that was, I would have said before we put any wing tags or GPS transmitters on birds, that they would be flying those sorts of distances whenever the hell they wanted to, which would be pretty regularly. But so with the tagged birds in particular, and then that's been confirmed with the GPS, we see the birds are regularly just moving within a 5-kilometre area squared. It's tiny. When we did the 5K lockdowns for COVID, that's all you needed to find for food and friends, and everything came from their homes for these cockies. That's a tiny area, and to have 100 cockies living in that small space and ultimately all of them finding all of the resources they need is mind-boggling. But yeah, so that's really been one that surprised me. The social learning, it's been great to be able to demonstrate it, but I don't think it was a surprise. There's been a lot of captive work like Jennifer's that has led us to think, hey, let's figure this out and see if we can demonstrate this with other behaviours in the wild.
Fantastic. So that's at Wing Tags and at Big City Birds 1. Somebody got in first. And actually, Jennifer, I'll just, for the benefit of the audio, at Raccoonologist is Jennifer's Twitter handle. Holly's at Birds in Backyards.
On Instagram, yes, at Birds in Backyards, but to make things difficult, couldn't get that for Twitter. So we're at Urban Birds on Twitter.
There we go. There we go. Holly, what's the most interesting or the most surprising behaviour that you have had reported to you or you have seen?
Oh, whoa. Oh gosh, you put me on the spot. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I think what I'm surprised about now is that nothing surprises me, I guess. I'm going to take the easy way out. That there is so much that we are learning about how birds respond in urban spaces that we shouldn't be surprised by what we are learning. You know, John and I have both been, I think we're at the point now where we've been working in this field for quite a while. And back in the day, there was next to nothing being done in urban spaces in terms of bird conservation or even research just, into birds. It was not considered a valuable space. It was just the other. Everything was focused on wild and natural areas. So there's been, in the last 20 years, this real push towards urban environments. And I think that is part of, I don't know which came first, but has meant that citizen science has had this sort of upswelling and there are these amazing opportunities and they are literally right outside your door to engage with nature and add to science at the same time, which means that we uncover like these amazing findings on how far sulphur-crested cockatoos will travel. I think we're finding that similarly with powerful owls. We found it similarly with superb fairy wrens across the spectrum in an urban space. Birds don't have to travel far. They get all their resources in a really tiny area. So why would they bother expending energy travelling huge distances and defending large territories? So I would just encourage people to look at the bird or the reptile or the marsupial that interests you, the plant that interests you. There will be a citizen science project that you can take part in and learn more about the amazing wildlife that we have in urban spaces.
Yes, I'm trying to pull together a resource of some of the great citizen science projects that I've come across. Not only in Australia, around the world, there's so many great ones going on. I will promote that when that's near ready for the birdemergency.com. I'd like to share something that I saw recently which blew me away. Not cockatoos, but got a family of local Australian ravens who frequent the strip shops near the bus stop that I use frequently. And I watched one parent, I couldn't tell which parent it was, teaching the two juveniles how tasty tomato sauce was. I'm sure we've all seen the ravens or crows getting into bags to get chips or the last little bits of the hot dog or whatever. Those thin plastic pie wrappers that half of your sauce gets left on. This raven was holding the wrapper with one foot, scraping its bill half open along that patch of sauce and obviously delighting in its tangy, pumpkiny tomato-winess and teaching juniors how to do it and finding other pie wrappers near the overflowing bin to share and obviously pass on that knowledge. So urban birds are ace. Urban birds are bloody ace. That's all I can say.
That should have been Holly's Twitter account. A bit long.
Except no one says ARE. You don't spell anything out anymore, John. Holly, we'll be doing this again in 2 weeks' time, talking something that we can wedge into birds in backyards and bird conservation, however we get to find it. So look out for at Bird Emergency on Twitter. I'll be promoting the bejesus out of it, no doubt. Dr. John Martin, thank you so much for being part of this Monday Megaphone. And Jennifer Colburn, probably 3:30 a.m. where you are now, I would say. Thanks for staying up and sharing your insights. And Dr. Holly Parsons, thank you again for being part of the show. Anything I've left out? Anyone?
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Grant.
Unbelievable. I must have got it right this time. Thanks, everyone, for being part of the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. We'll join you. I'll be back this time next week with someone who's not in Australia talking about birds, but we'll be back with Holly Parsons in a fortnight. Thanks, everyone. Bye.